Hello, Bravos. We're back with Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor. Mayor. We'll just go with Mayor. Mayo. The Mayor of Mayo. Fuck it, that's good enough. Napoleon and women. Alfred Adler taught that a well-integrated personality, a normal, happy man, must be adjusted to the claims of the three things: society, occupation, and sex. Or in other words, the social life. His job and love. From Napoleon's history and from our physical and psychological examination, we have drawn some conclusions about the kind of man he was. He dominated society and was never in much doubt that he had chosen the job for which he was. Wait, emperor's a job? Come on now. But what about sex and the ability to love? It is this adjustment which many people find the most difficult of the three, and so it was in Napoleon's case. In dealing with Napoleon's relations with women, I will not attempt to cover in detail the extremely varied field. This has already been done, first by the French scholar Frédéric Masson, who studied every aspect of Napoleon's life and character, with all the advantage of many journals and letters discovered since Masson's day. The subject has been more exhaustively surveyed by Gertrude Artes in Germany, 1927, by R.F. Delderfield, an English authority on the Napoleonic era, 1959, and by Guy Breton in France, 1965. When Mr. Delderfield says in his book Napoleon in Love, I have that there is a curious sterility about his love affairs, and only two of them seem to have influenced his character and to any appreciable degree. He is not, of course, speaking about sterility in the medical sense with which I have been concerned, but in elaborating his theme, and in incidentally giving us a wonderful picture of Napoleon's love life. In a nutshell, he poses a highly significant question. He was a superb administrator with the supreme quality, entirely absent in most organizers, of inspiring the unswerving devotion of millions of men. Men! His genius fell altogether when he came to deal with women, and his record in this field is strangely pitiful. He paid court to women of every type. He was passionate lover to a few, a tolerant husband to two, and a generous friend and protector to scores. They repaid him with at best the dutiful compliance of a Victorian wife, at worst black treachery and shameless ingratitude. Why was it that Napoleon could inspire men to die, blessing him without being capable of inspiring more than a tepid, self-seeking affection in the hearts of women? Napoleon's magnetic power to inspire men and the methods by which he deliberately cultivated it have been described in Chapter 1. Now, if we are to find the answer to Mr. Delderfield's question, we must examine his relations with women. In this chapter, I will deal mainly with women in general, and in the next two chapters with some of the women with whom his name has been associated, his wives, sweethearts, and mistresses. The late Mr. Shaw Desmond, a prolific writer about sex, considered that the love personality of Napoleon is one of the most elusive phenomena in history, and certainly the literature on the subject is baffling in its extensiveness and in the contradictory opinions which it contains. But as usual, we are lucky that so many of Napoleon's own statements have been recorded. Among the many subjects on which he pontificated as emperor, none received more attention than the relations between men and women, love, marriage, and divorce. His youthful reflections are to be found in his diaries and other writings. He was positively obsessed with the subject, and in much of what he said and wrote about women, and in his conduct towards many of them, there is evidence of that unconscious tendency to revenge against the opposite sex, described by Wilhelm Reich, beginning fairly mildly when he was about 17 or 18 with, I consider love to be harmful both to society and to private happiness. He soon worked himself up to diatribes against women in a scornful and contemptuous vein. The Oriental attitude to women, he said, was better than ours, and he defended the practice of polygamy on the crude grounds that a wife is no use to her husband when she is pregnant, or nursing her children, or ill, and she ceases to be his wife when she can no longer have children. He certainly lacked the gallantry to women which is associated with the French, and he said that women received too much attention in France and should not be treated as men's equals, but as slaves, mere machines to make children. He gave it as his opinion that women's duties are submission and dependence. The misogynistic nature indicated by such language came to the surface in many harsh encounters with women who were left with ruffled feelings and often in tears by his abominable rudeness. Criticisms of their dress, hairstyle, makeup, and general appearance, comments on the fact that they had not yet secured husbands, or if they were married, that they had not yet had children, were expressed with a lack of delicacy, a coarse familiarity, or even a positive vulgarity, which astound and disgust our own more well-mannered generation. Yeah. Even in those rougher days, a lady surely did not go to court expecting an emperor to ask if her unattractive appearance was due to being pregnant, to tell her that she looked like a corpse and should use more rouge, that her hair was a fright, her arms too red, that she looked like a washerwoman, or to ask with a very pointed stare if she was able to nurse her children. All these unpleasantnesses and many more were perpetuated by the Emperor Napoleon. He would ask young unmarried girls if they had had any children, and would taunt married women with having a fine time when their husbands were in the field. "Goodness, I heard you were pretty," was an awkward observation for a young lady to receive calmly on her first appearance at court. The tales of Napoleon's rudeness to women could fill many pages. We're waiting. One famous woman, Germaine de Stael, eager to admire, was soon converted into a formidable foe. Napoleon disliked, perhaps even feared, intellectual women, and as intellect was Madame de Stael's long suit, she was not well pleased when Napoleon told her that he considered that the greatest woman was she who had most children. She grew to detest him, and although herself a great talker, she was for once speechless when Napoleon stopped in front of her at court and said, "No doubt you nursed your children yourself." After a pause, he went on, remarking to his brother Lucien, "You see, she doesn't want to say yes or no." But he was always curious to know what she had been saying about him. She was fascinated by his personality, and she probably deserved the rebuffs which she received. Wait. She was fascinated by his personality, and she probably deserved the rebuffs she received, culminating in her exile from France, for she could be a most embarrassing person to those whom she admired. She almost made a cult of embarrassing people. Wait, is she the same motherfucker as Napoleon? Speculation ran wild about what inspired her strange remark when she had forced her way into the first council room in the Rue Chantereine whilst he was in his bath. Bath. Genius has no sex. Though by some to have been a comment on his anatomy, it seems far more likely to have been intended to relieve his embarrassment. But she was very curious about his attitude to women, and once asked him outright if it was true that he did not love women. His reply, "Madam, I love my wife," delighted her, and she said, Epaminondas would have answered me thus. Epaminondas. Napoleon's abominable rudeness did not spare even Josephine, whom he loved as much as he was capable of loving. It may be stretching a point to include in the catalogue of his cruelties to her the malicious glee with which he caused the horses drawing her caleche to be whipped up to a wild gallop over appalling roads and through deep fords in order to gloat over her nervous terror. I only know that word because it's in a Pixie song, a recent one. Nasty remarks about the paint and powder which his aging wife used to preserve her fading charms were too deliberate and too public to be forgiven. His conduct is desecrating the shrine of her greatest happiness. Her beloved Malmaison was especially horrid. In his well recognized mania for destruction, he would slash and uproot valuable plants in her hothouse and shoot at rare wildfowl fowl on the lake. But the most execrable example of his cruelty was a remark which he made publicly when one day he had wanted to take some guests to shoot at the animals in the park. Josephine tearfully protested, saying, "All the animals are with young. It is not the season for shooting." Her loving husband said roughly that he must give up his plan, adding, "It seems that everything is prolific here, except Madame." That was a good comeback. Chivalrous French courtiers hardly knew where to look on many such occasions. Most of the victims of his gross discourtesy seemed to have suffered it in embarrassed silence, but a certain duchess, who had rather reluctantly become one of Josephine's ladies-in-waiting, neatly turned the tables on the boorish Corsican who so ardently longed to be thought French. He had referred to the fact that her face was badly pitted by smallpox, and was tartly told, "A Frenchman could never have told me so." One young lady of easy virtue, with no position at court to lose, also answered back boldly, "I believe you are fond of men," remarked the emperor to her sarcastically. "Yes, when they are polite." That's a great comeback. Napoleon, with his magnetic power to charm men, could it be he chose charming to women also? Could it? Napoleon, with his magnetic power to charm men, could, if he chose, be charming to women also. But the many women he did not choose to charm naturally felt bitter about his rudeness and boorishness, and spread the belief that he was a woman-hater. Claire de Remusat, the attractive wife of a court chamberlain, who spent many years at court, summed it up by saying, "The emperor despises women. He cannot learn to love them." She said that she had never heard him say an amiable word to any of the ladies of the court, and she believed that it was his constant desire to inspire fear which prevented him from establishing truly friendly, intimate relations with anyone. Madame de Remusat may have been a little prejudiced, for at one time there had been quite a tender relationship between them, and she had seen with pain the pleasant young man she thought she knew grow morose, self-centered, and suspicious. But Napoleon himself admitted that he had had to surround himself with an aura of fear to prevent familiarity after his too rapid rise to royal dignity. Towards the end of his life, he boasted that he had never allowed himself to be ruled by a woman. In fact, he had always been very much afraid of being dominated by some woman who would take advantage of the sentimental side of his nature. Josephine knew all about that side of him, and she said that he was weaker and more sensitive than anyone supposed. Her daughter Hortense, who gave her stepfather unstinted, selfless devotion, was bold enough to tell him outright that he underestimated the influence which women had over men, but told him women are not for you because you do not take enough trouble to be nice to them. He concealed his sentimentality by pretending to be sensual and unsentimental, and by his rudeness he kept scheming women at arm's length. Frederick Masson thought that Napoleon's brusqueness and coarse talk were assumed in order to conceal the embarrassment which he felt in the presence of women. Other historians have also believed that his rudeness was camouflage for a basic timidity with women. Napoleon himself said, "My character renders me extremely timid in their company." He once said, "Love is not for me. I am not as other men." In St. Helena, he was even more precise and self-revealing. A conversation between Las Casas and Napoleon was recorded in the memoirs of Count Horace de Villecastel, a popular diarist of the Second Empire. I often talked about the emperor with Monsieur de las Casas. He told me that at St. Helena, Napoleon used to speak sometimes of his feebleness in the game of love. It did not amount to much. Faiblesse dans les déduits. Was this an avowal of his fears of impotence? Napoleon, a compulsive talker about himself, chose for this confidence the least impressive of the non-entities amongst whom he ended his days. Count Emmanuel Augustin Dieudonné Martin Joseph de la Casas, an insignificant, though aristocratic little secretary, as short as his name was long, had at the end of Napoleon's career insinuated himself into the emperor's household, hysterically proclaiming devotion and carrying flattery, it was said, so far as to be shorter than his hero. Such a confession recorded by such a person may have little significance, but it was not the only evidence of Napoleon's obsession with the subject of impotence. And I am prepared to believe it, because of the evidence which I have recorded about Napoleon's physical and mental makeup. Wilhelm Stekel, in his mammoth work, Impotence, in the Mail notes the association of Napoleon's hypertrophic ambition with the strikingly small, infantile, undersized genitals revealed at the post-mortem examination. Impotence, or the fear of it, which is much more than 90% of the problem, is a cause of much marital unhappiness and unnecessary celibacy. And Stekel sees it as the great problem of modern civilization, though, paradoxically, he thinks that the erotic life of our time is richer than that of primitive men, amongst whom it was governed by periods of rut, as with animals. Impotence is preponderantly a psychological, not a physical disability, as Napoleon clearly implied when he wrote, just put it in English, dude. He wrote several procès-verbaux on the subject, in one of which he said that it was unheard of for a husband to bring forward his own impotence to prove the illegitimacy of his child. In another, he said, if the husband is impotent and admits it, it is as much as to say that he is fortunate that another has been found to beget a child for him, an innuendo which he was inordinately careful to avoid at the time of the birth of the King of Rome. Now, all this concern with such a human problem was perfectly understandable in the lawgiver of France, and could not be put forward as an indication of his own fears of impotence, were it not for the fact that the emperor's impotence aroused widespread interest, rumor, and speculation throughout Europe, and was even discussed by Napoleon himself in his family circle with surprising freedom. So convinced do they all seem to have been that he was impotent, that in the course of the frequent Bonaparte family debates about naming Napoleon's heir, the possibility of a child of his own was never even considered. He does not seem to have resented this attitude, and once said to his elder brother Joseph, I am childless. You all think me impotent, and Josephine, despite her anxiety, is not likely to bear children now. So after me, the deluge. In his brother Lucien's version of this odd family discussion, Napoleon's comments on Josephine reads, she will have no more children, even if she is willing to have them by another man. This tends to confirm the existence of the plot to foist a substituted child on the French people as Napoleon's heir. The memoirs of his stepdaughter Hortense make it plain that she and her mother Josephine often discussed the prospect of Napoleon becoming a father. After a stormy scene with Josephine about his affairs with mistresses, when he still hoped to avoid facing up to divorce, Napoleon told her that she need not worry about him seriously falling in love, as she ought to know that he was not made for love, and his affections were never seriously involved. Bonapartes detested Josephine so intensely that they would have welcomed any evidence that it was she, and not Napoleon, who was to blame for the infertility of the marriage. It is generally accepted that it was to obtain such evidence that his sister Caroline and her husband Joachim Murat contrived the liaison between Napoleon and Eleanor Denuel, which is described later. Before Napoleon's somewhat dubious acceptance of Eleanor's child as his own had removed the last objection to divorcing Josephine, he had proposed to adopt as his heir the oldest son of his brother Louis and Hortense. Despite strenuous protests by Louis, who said, "Such a favor from you to this child would revive rumors that you are his father." These rumors about the child's paternity had made Hortense's relations with her husband most difficult, and although it is hard to believe this, it was actually from Napoleon himself that she first heard of the scandal. She was horrified, and all the more so because Napoleon was quite pleased about it for reasons of state, and seemed to think that she ought to be flattered rather than distressed. He had tried to persuade Josephine that the rumors were due to the wish of the public that he should have a child. Hortense's feelings mattered little to him. Far from being worried about the scandal, he was positively delighted and was still chatting gaily about it in St. Helena. Napoleon, though tolerant of the loose morals of others, was very careful of the reputation of his own family circle, and he would surely never have allowed, far less spread abroad, this suggestion of impropriety if it had not helped to counter the rumors about his own impotence, which he knew to be current in France. It is not surprising that Napoleon's impotence should have been a topic of conversation in the army. His almost defiant exhibition of his curious body to Antommarchi has already been described. On campaigns, he bathed outside his tent in sight of his troops. Soldiers are quick to form their own conclusions in such matters, and no doubt the guesswork and gossip gains substance from forthright comments, like that of the soldier who laughed at a comrade's question, if the emperor had any children, saying, "You fool, don't you know that he keeps his private parts in his head?" Caulaincourt attributed this remark to a grenadier in the camp at Bologna. I don't know. Bertrand, who said it was made by a soldier in Italy, called it an old joke. This old joke is told in more than one book and sometimes in bawdier language, but it is significant that Caulaincourt's version of it reads, it's in French, "Love affairs in the head." This seems to endow the legendary soldier with more delicacy and far deeper perception. I have expressed the view that Napoleon lacked a sense of humor, and certainly books about him do not offer many openings for humor. By a happy chance, a sample of the quiet sense of fun of Mr. Maurice Wigan, the television critic of the Sunday Times, has a distinct bearing on Napoleon's sexual difficulties. 92% of all men worry that their penises are too small, said an American psychologist in Man Alive's piece, The Naked Ego. Not 93%, nor 91%, as you used to believe in your happy-go-lucky way. I do love the categorical precision of these holy stumblebums who go around catechizing, sizing. Is it sizing or catechizing? No, it's catechism. Catechizing. I don't know how to say it. Representative samples of the hapless population and cross-fertilizing their statistics to produce ever more garish freak blossoms of wisdom and delight. I think Mr. Wigan was quite right to poke fun at those who turn out statistics based upon a section of the population who are prepared to discuss their intimate affairs. And indeed, some such objections were raised about the Kinsey report, but whatever we may think of this particular stumblebum, the human problem which he disclosed as a real one, having been educated at a Scottish public school where we all swam stark naked in the river, I was a little surprised when, for the first time as a very new army doctor, I dashed happily into an Indian river with more than 100 naked soldiers to see how many of them used one or both hands, fig leaf in lieu of, as the quartermaster might have put it. Maturing experience taught me that such a simple sign of modesty could betray an underlying anxiety. I recall one young soldier who believed quite mistakenly that his body was inadequately masculine. He told me that he never undressed in daylight and waited in the barrack room until lights out before undressing and getting into bed. Napoleon, whose hypogonadism was really something to worry about, seems to have been without prudery, but we shall see in due course how it may have complicated his search for a wife. Gossip about Napoleon's impotence certainly spread widely, if clandestinely, in France, and naturally the ripples spread into enemy and allied countries, where they were received with malicious glee. The most illustrious of all speculators about Napoleon's sexual potency were the Russian imperial family. When Napoleon decided to marry a second wife, his choice fell upon a young Russian Grand Duchess. Such a marriage would cement his friendship with the Tsar Alexander. A ukase of Tsar Paul had given the Dowager Empress entire control over her daughter's marriage, and she was determined not to allow this one, because she had heard that Napoleon was not as other men. "What," said the Dowager Empress, "shall I marry my daughter to a man who can be husband to nobody? Another man will then come into my daughter's bed if they want her to have children. She is not made for that." She is known to have had inquiries made about the delicate matter in France by the Crown Prince Frederick Louis of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. He carried out his task with so little finesse that Talleyrand advised the emperor to dismiss him from court. His report confirmed the Dowager Empress's repugnance to the proposed marriage and fortified her in her arguments with her son, the Tsar, who had been inclined to say that it was all just scurrilous gossip. Now she could assure him that it was Josephine herself who had coined the cruel little quip, "Bonaparte est bourrin," and that she had described her husband's incapacity in crude and indelicate terms. Napoleon might look like other men, she had said, but so did Crescentini, the castrato tenor, and he could produce nothing. She had repudiated suggestions that she was responsible for the infertility of the marriage by pointing out that she had had children during her first marriage and had still been comparatively young when she had married Napoleon, who had been no use at all and was able to do nothing. These remarks were recorded in General Bertrand's journal, and the italics are his. And the italic of closing this out for the time being are mine. Not only can I fit it in the 33 allotted minutes that the Illuminati put into my phone, but I really don't feel like it because this is boring as dog piss. Goodbye for now, bruvs. Goodbye.